This is the third part of Yvon's What Has Become of the Russian Revolution. Part 3 is titled The State and Classes. Section 1 is titled Official or Fictitious Power. The headings are the Soviets, the bureaucracy. Section 2 is titled The Real Power, with the headings the party, the structure of the party, Stalin. And section 3 is titled The New Classes, the so-called, quote, manual labor, the small and middle, quote, employee, the responsible specialist. The class struggle continues. All right. And this is the final part of this book. Okay. As elsewhere, the state in Russia pretends to be what it is not. All governments find it convenient to inscribe on public monuments, prisons, banks, and lodging houses fine formulae like liberty, equality, fraternity. Such good intentions are condensed in constitutional text to form the false front of state power. They are the insignia of the officials or fictitious power. In the traditional capitalist society, such official, political simulacra disguise the real power of the large financial and industrial corporations. Similarly, in the USSR, the advertised demagogic devices of the Soviets are used to hide a totally different apparatus, which is the real holder of state power. But, quote, state power connotes the existence of classes. Are there classes in contemporary Russia? We shall examine in this part the following points. 1. The official or fictitious power. 2. The real state power. And 3. Classes. Section 1. The official or fictitious power. First heading. The Soviets. In 1871, during the Paris Commune, the world saw an attempt at social organization by the workers themselves. Neighborhood organizations, committees composed of workers in arms, elected their representatives, and undertook the creation of a workers' militia. Such spontaneous popular organizations were seen again in Russia in 1905, and then in 1917, when they actually took power. In 1917, the Russian Soviets included all worker tendencies from social democrats to anarchists. But the Soviets of the revolutionary period soon disappeared. The organisms that bear the name, quote, Soviets today are officially said to be the sources of state power in Russia really have less power than the French municipal councils. They are no more than organs employed by the central power to execute its orders in the limits of the municipalities. The power of the present Soviets is a farce of power, and the elections to the Soviets are a commercial takeoff on elections. Are a comical takeoff on elections. The last Soviet elections took place at the end of 1934. As in preceding elections, the following happened. The electoral campaign was carried on exclusively by the government. In the entire USSR, the same speech was delivered. This speech dealt with the following topics: praise to Stalin, the, quote, success of socialism, end quote, in Russia, the need to struggle against, quote, counter-revolutionary tendencies. Then in the villages, the factories, the offices, the candidates voted for, quote, deputies to the Soviets, end quote. The best list of candidates had already been prepared by the party officials. The Bolshevik Party alone could present candidates. That is the only time when the electors manifested not their power but their political existence. They voted by raising hands at meetings held in their places of work. Sometimes the small officials in charge permitted themselves to ask, quote, all those against raise hands. They then recorded a unanimous vote for. The people had voted. Bands of music waited at the doors. The people were led in good marching order into the streets. The sole function of the deputies that were, quote, elected in this manner was to, quote, elect in their turn in the same manner by raising hands a list of candidates prepared for them by the higher party organs. They thus, quote, elected members of the executive committee of their local Soviet as well as deputies to the district Soviets, following the same procedure. The latter chose the immediately superior executive committee as well as the deputies to the provincial congresses of Soviets. This was continued in a pyramidal fashion up to the election of the Congress of the Soviets of the USSR, said to be the supreme organ of power in the country. According to the last but one constitution, this Congress was supposed to meet every 2 years. In fact, more than 4 years passed before the last one met. Following the usual rigmarole, the Supreme Congress, quote, elected the Central Executive Committee. The legislative role of all these deputies, local, regional, and pan-Soviet, ends once they have raised their hands in unanimous assent. They have, however, another ritual gesture to perform. Periodically, the Soviet deputies meet to approve the acts of their executive committees. These acts have long ago been executed. That is called, quote, control. The deputies have a third function. This is a serious task. The Soviet deputies must always act as the defenders of the policy of the state. A deputy must carry on. One second. Where am I? To remain a deputy must carry on continuous propaganda in favor of all the acts of the government. To remain a deputy, he must prove himself a proficient propagandist. If he is not assiduous enough in the performance of his assignment, he loses his title of deputy, and that is something that an ambitious citizen does not care to do. For the rank of deputy is the first step upward in the Soviet hierarchy. A man who is clever enough to prove beyond doubt that he can obey blindly will climb high. In theory, the Soviets and their congresses constitute the legislative arm of the state power. And in theory, the executive power is exercised by the executive committees chosen at the various Soviet congresses. These executive committees have a broader power, or rather a broader field of activity, than the Soviets, but it is understood that this activity never reaches beyond the tasks assigned to the executive committees by the real government. Each committee member is given a special function, a concrete task to accomplish. The Central Executive Committee, named by the General Congress of Soviets and said to represent the central executive power of the USSR, is composed of about 600 members. It meets once a year or so for a few days to perform the formality of approving acts that were accomplished long ago by the higher authority. The latter, named by the Central Executive Committee, is made up of a presidium of 30 members and the various commissars of the people, who exercise legislative and executive power between sessions of the Central Committee, that is, practically all the time. The, quote, new Constitution, quote, adopted on the 5th of December 1936, does not suggest a basic change in government. It merely consecrates the Soviets as municipal councils, which they always were, replaces the Central Executive Committee with a, quote, Supreme Council of the Union, end quote, and the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee with a Presidium of the Supreme Council. These are new names for the old fakes. They will not give the country one shred of real liberty. New heading, the bureaucracy. The mentioned highest authority exercises its power by means of a bureaucracy appointed administratively by the directors of the commissariats and the presidiums. This bureaucracy does not depend in the slightest degree on the supposed electors. In other words, the entire scaffolding of delegates to the different Soviets has not a bit of power. There is nothing of the original Soviets about them, for the principle of the Soviets of 1917 was that all power should come from below, that state power should be exercised by the base. In the present Russian system, the higher organs of government exercise absolute power. Everything is decided on and accomplished in the offices of the various commissariats. Not a law, not a decree, not a decision springs from the workers at the social base. Not a law, not a decree, not a decision is proposed by the Central Executive Committee or the Congress of Soviets. In practice, no law, no decree, no decision has even the need of being approved by the Central Executive Committee of the Congress of Soviets. Every decree, every decision of a permanent organ of the government is immediately implacable and is immediately applied. 1, 2, or 3 years later, these acts will receive, in a lump, the automatic approval of the approving machines that we described above. Absolutism is total here. A so-called People's Commissar is a minister possessing unlimited power in his department. He has no opposition to contend with, no organization, no parliament, no instrument of public opinion, not even any purely verbal criticism can gainsay his acts. True, the supreme leader of the Communist Party can organize the vilification of a commissar when he wants to destroy him or when he wants to burden him with the responsibility for his own mistakes. Otherwise, no minister, no great executive power in any country has a power equal to that of a Soviet People's Commissar, as long as he remains in accord with the power which, behind the false facade of the Soviet Constitution, old or new, is the veritable master. We shall now examine the real Soviet state. Section 2. The real power. The study of the rights of man and of our Constitution tells us little about the real makeup of our society. To understand what hides behind the red flag of the USSR, we must make before the fictitious power of the Russian Soviets the same effort at critical thought that we exert before the false front of the traditional bourgeois republic. Heading: the party. The essential political organization of the USSR is the Communist Party, usually referred simply to as, quote, the party. The party includes 1,500,000 to 2 million active members. Besides, there is the, quote, waiting list of 500 to 800,000 aspiring members. This for a population of 168 million. There are few old revolutionaries, old Bolsheviks from the period of revolutionary struggle, left in the party. They play in it the role of honorary members provided with sinecures. Since 1924, it is the young who compose the enormous majority of the party membership. They are disciplined soldiers obeying without a murmur. The great majority of the party is composed of workers or former workers. But all the chiefs, today as formerly, are intellectuals. Whether by chance or for other reasons, the party is the reduced image of the entire Soviet society. On one side, you have the, quote, initiates, the leaders, the directors, the possessors of reasons, science, and power. On the other side are the troops, subjected to a strict discipline. To enter the party, the candidate must undergo a probationary stage and have some sponsors. For a worker, the probationary stage is 6 months, and he must have 2 sponsors with more than a year's membership. A soldier needs 6 months probation, but he requires 2 sponsors with 2 years membership. The peasant and artisan need 1 year's probation and 3 sponsors with 2 years membership. Clerks and intellectuals need 2 years probation and 5 sponsors with 5 years membership. The young intellectual, the careerist who wants to get to the top quickly, and for that, party membership is indispensable, hires himself out as a worker in order to enter the party sooner and to profit through his entire career by the advantages accruing to an origin that has remained privileged for demagogic reasons as well as out of sheer inertia. At the opening of the periodic recruiting campaign, for which the candidates have, of course, been preparing all the time by canvassing for recommendations and seeking all possible aid to enter the party, the center decides in advance, depending on the policy of the moment, what percentage of new members will be recruited from the various sections of the population. It is decided, for example, to permit the inclusion of 75,000 new members of worker origin, 10% of peasant origin, 30% women, 70% men, etc. Each candidate then undergoes a political examination in the local communist cell, and the district committee decides whether or not the applicant should be admitted. To be admitted, good intentions are not enough, and a, quote, revolutionary temperament is of little avail. You must, first of all, know your catechism and give clear proof that you will be docile in the future. Once in the party, you have your foot in the stirrup. It is impossible to make your way outside of the party, or at least without its approval. This is as true for the worker in the shop as for the engineer in his office and the actor in his theater. You first begin walking toward the sun when you enter the party. The party card, or at least membership in the youth organization, is the decisive trump card that you must hold to enter all higher schools. Factory directors and all members of the administration are party members. Nearly 72% of the colonels of the Red Army, 90% of generals of divisions, 100% of the generals of Army Corps belong to the party. 75 to 80% of the professors and students of the principal universities are party or Komsomol members. Party membership is therefore the only road leading to a good position, fat salaries and honors. There are many good positions to be filled in a country where the old ruling class has disappeared. Ambition has a lot of room where the newness of the political and economic regime renders experience less important than usual. Everybody is then said to have a, quote, marshal's baton in his knapsack, unquote. But the party does not offer all these advantages without certain conditions. First of all, it exacts in exchange from its members blind, absolute submission to the order of its higher organs. It insists that members act in accordance with the discipline of the party at every moment of his life. It insists that he lives always in accordance with the formula, on every occasion, first a member of the party. The party members must know how to use, in the last important conversation, the phrases found in the catechism of the moment. He must cultivate his gifts as an organizer, as a, quote, leader, as an orator, so as to be able to contribute in the maximum degree to, quote, put across the latest party slogan, party policy, the latest party maneuvers. A convenient moral code, similar to that imposed by Loyola on his soldiers, silences in the party members every hesitation, every scruple, every remorse when there is a party order to be executed. The party member must have complete confidence in the higher organs of the party. Constant spying on those about him is a virtue. The party members must also be careful of his own behavior in public. Anything that may take on the appearance of a scandal in the eyes of the world must be carefully covered up. Once an individual has entered this organization, it is no longer possible for him to leave it of his own accord. He must stay inside it if he does not want to lose all the big and small advantages he has gotten as a result of his party membership. To leave the party means to expose himself to the danger of being considered for always an enemy of the regime. The man who committed such a foolishness would be in the position of an unfrocked cleric. It is preferable to be put out of the party for a moral slip or for an infringement of the common law than for a political transgression. Since the inconveniences that come with party membership do not outweigh its advantages, there is a rush to get into the party. Party membership excites the appetite and emulation of all that have this, quote, stuff, are ambitious, and are not troubled with too bothersome a conscience. To enter the party means to serve, at the same time, the existing power, the fatherland, and one's personal interests. This is how the party is composed. Let us now see its structure. New heading: the structure of the party. Like the official Soviet state, the Communist Party is constructed in the form of a pyramid. In every place of work there is a communist cell with its secretary. A grade higher is the town committee. The town committee, directing the activity of the cells in each locality. Above it is the district committee. The district committee, directing the activity of the committees of a number of localities. Above the district committee is the provincial committee. Then the Republic Committee. Still higher we find the Central Committee, and finally the Political Bureau. These are the organisms that exercise the real state power under the cover of the corresponding Soviet organs. The entire system is hierarchic. An official is, quote, proposed. That is, he is named by the superior organs. At every stop of the pyramid, the secretary, the essential element of each committee, is chosen and, quote, proposed by the immediate higher organ. Let us examine the role of each of these ranks. The party member. The member of the cell is first of all a diffuser of opinion, an overseer of public activity and opinion. There is a card for him in the office of his cell. He himself is subject to surveillance by a superior. The cell and its secretary. The cell has the cell's bureau. The cell meets at least twice a month. The cell has its obligatory political courses. The cell's informational meetings, which are private or public depending on party requirements. At the factory, we have seen the real power is exercised by what is called the, quote, triangle, composed of the factory director, the president of the trade union committee, and the secretary of the communist cell. The three are generally members of the party. The cell secretary is the real power. The cell secretary is the person whom everybody fears and respects. The trade union heads show him the deference usually accorded to an all-powerful superior. The committee and the committee's party. Above the party cell we find in each city, in each district, in each province, in each republic, a corresponding party committee. The job of each committee is to transmit the orders of the party center, adapting the orders of the party center to its geographic sphere, and controlling and supervising the cell's secretaries, through whom the work of the cells is directed. The secretary of the party committee controls the political life in his sphere, as well as the activity of the trusts, industries, and commerce in his region. He does that through the intermediary of the directorates of these establishments. No administration or an enterprise or a trade union will make a move or apply the smallest decision without first consulting the secretary of the corresponding party committee and soliciting his approval. Similarly, no manager of a factory or an enterprise and no functionary of a trade union will be appointed or, quote, proposed by the higher government organs without previously getting the approval of the Secretary of the Party Committee. All conflicts of decision are judged by the higher authorities of the party in accordance with a single criterion, the general line of the party. The Secretary of the Party Committee is the all-powerful government of his territory in social, moral, political, economic matters. He is answerable for his actions only to the higher rank of the party. Locally, he has absolute power. The Central Committee and the Central Committee's Political Bureau. In the center of Moscow rises a huge, imposing edifice. All its doors are carefully guarded by GPU agents in uniform. Inside there are vast offices with immense files. These contain carefully numbered and classified information about all the political and economic responsibilities in the country. That is the seat of the Central Committee of the party. This Central Committee is composed of 71 members and 68 substitutes. The Central Committee proposes and names the directors of the highest economic organs, the commissars of the people, and all other important Soviet dignitaries. It is the source of all decrees, all laws, all important decisions in every sphere of the life of the country. But the Central Committee is itself directed by the Political Bureau. The 10 members of the Political Bureau are apparently the masters of the country. The 10 members of the Political Bureau are the real initiates. It is in the secret intimacy of the office of the Politburo that the economic and political activity of the country is determined. From there, through the intermediary of the General Committee, come all orders, to be transmitted over the nervous system of the party. New heading: the Secretary General of the Central Committee. But the 10 men of the Political Bureau are only the tools and confidants of a single person. It is he who has chosen them and is their unquestionable master, Stalin. Stalin is the Secretary General of the Central Committee of the party. In this position, Stalin has succeeded as a result of long, detailed effort to make of the party apparatus a sure and modern instrument of domination, his domination. All the high functionaries of the party owe Stalin their positions. The high functionaries of the party have sought their jobs and obtained their jobs thanks to their fidelity and devotion to Stalin, the high functionaries' master. Little by little, all functionaries, even those of the third order, who appeared to be doubtful in the slightest degree, have been eliminated. All now owe everything to Stalin, who has the patient and minute talent of feeding the flame of gratefulness owed Stalin, who, which is more important, has a remarkable flair for discovering in time all those capable of opposition to him. Once they are discovered, he destroys them in cold blood and with complete unscrupulousness. It is Stalin who draws up the list of members of the Political Bureau and the members of the Central Committee. It is Stalin who designates the all-powerful governors of the provinces and the large cities, that is, the secretaries of the party committees. It is Stalin who names the commissars of the people and all the high functionaries of the state, each of whom is a master in his own sphere, each of whom designates in his turn devoted directors in the secondary spheres. In this hierarchy, appointed and controlled from top to bottom, resides the incomparable homogeneity of the party of the Soviet regime. Many books have been written about the man who thus holds centralized in his hands the most formidable power in history. We know of only one serious book on the subject, Stalin, by Boris Souvarin, a former important member of the Third International. I actually just put the introduction to that book up today. This book, unequaled in any language, summarizes and clarifies an immense amount of documentation on the entire Russian Revolution. New heading: Stalin, Stalin, a native of Georgia, was a student in a religious seminary. After receiving a religious education up to the age of 17, Stalin joined the socialist movement when the first social democratic groups were being formed in Georgia. In the course of his activities, Stalin received several sentences and was deported to Siberia between the First and Second Revolution. Stalin is one of the very few Bolshevik leaders who were never abroad. In Lenin's day, Stalin was a professional revolutionary of the second or third rank. Therefore, Stalin's accession to power after Lenin's death was for many entirely unexpected. At that time, all the Bolshevik tendencies struggling over power in the party. At the time, all the Bolshevik tendencies struggled over power in the party. So many illustrious names figuring in the past struggles were inscribed at the head of the contending groups that the victory of the obscure Stalin was like a thunderclap. The following will explain Stalin's victory. While the various rivals were destroying one another, Stalin was biding his time. Stalin's position as the Supreme Party Secretary made Stalin master of the files of the Central Committee. Stalin knew how to use it to prepare the, quote, very spicy dish that Lenin foresaw. While Stalin's rivals tried to win by means of their talents as polemicists, orators, or writers, Stalin contented himself with manipulating the party file. Stalin created positions. Stalin placed his henchmen at strategic points. One way or another, party functionaries became Stalin's men. As a result of favors, displacements, and promotions, Stalin won for himself the party machinery. Stalin became the master. This termite's labor lasted years. After Lenin's death, the great Bolshevik leaders who were to divide Lenin's succession were Zinoviev, Trotsky, Bukharin, Kamenev, Rykov, Tomsky. To begin with, all formed a coalition against Trotsky, the strongest. Trotsky was defeated in 1924 and 1925. The victors then divided themselves into two opposing camps, the Bukharin-Rykov-Stalin coalition against Zinoviev-Kamenev. The coalition won easily. Sorry, I accidentally skipped my thing. Skipped a page. All right, here we are. In the third phase of the battle, Rykov and Stalin vanquished Bukharin. In 1928, Stalin got rid of Rykov and Tomsky, his last rivals. The file had conquered. Machiavelli did not know the use of the modern file. Other times, another technique. In 1936 and 1937 came the trial and execution of the old Bolshevik leaders. The individual whose, quote, hand does not tremble, end quote, decided on the physical destruction of his old competitors. Stalin's intelligence is not imaginative. Stalin's intelligence is practical. No idea applied by Stalin is Stalin's own. Stalin borrows ideas and doctrines from the persons around him, but Stalin applies those ideas and doctrines with the brutality, with the drunken ardor of an absolute master in whom the exercise of power merely increases the need of commanding. Without pity, Stalin tries out his borrowed conceptions on the entire people. He stops only when his experiments risk toppling over the pyramid of which he is the peak. Stalin has boasted, as of a virtue, of his readiness to sacrifice one or several generations to what he calls the construction of socialism. The construction of socialism. In cold blood, Stalin verifies the conceptions that have won his attention by experimenting on the Russian people in the manner of a scientist performing vivisectory experiments in his laboratory. Many villages of peasants have been deported to concentration camps for showing resistance to his, quote, collectivization. The term, quote, Red Pope best describes the head of the new Russian absolutism. Stalin is, in fact, the autocratic head of a new religion, which has its faithful, its sincere devotees, its fanatics and servants all over the world. He is the director of a strategy that has its soldiers and corporals everywhere on the globe. Many persons in various countries show him devotion and obedience that borders on idolatry. He has his artists, politicians, chroniclers, and propagandists. His personal power is incomparably solid. He continues to employ the method that has served him so well. He is very careful about his immediate entourage, and he is very jealous about his reputation. A god cannot remain a god if he does not receive constant praise. As soon as Stalin issues a slogan, thousands of newspapers, orators, teachers, artists immediately pick it up and repeat it all at once. As soon as Stalin has delivered a speech, the entire country comments on it. Young people in the schools and universities, the entire youth learn it by heart. Professors of philosophy make of it the subject of their courses. Journalists take it as the topic of their leading articles. Writers and artists go through contortions to find in it perils of eloquence and style, to discover in it most unexpected virtues, the profundity of genius, and the most splendid literary jewels. Linguistic institutes study the technique of Stalinian language. The people around him imitate his style, his voice, his gestures, his tastes. When Stalin decided to introduce the use of rabbit meat in Russia to make up for the destruction of cattle, the restaurants and lunchrooms began serving the non-existent rabbit meat. Peasants had to raise rabbits. Newspapers spoke of rabbits. Teachers of natural history studied the noble animal rabbit. Art students were made to paint rabbits. Writers composed stories about rabbits. Posters glorifying rabbits were exhibited in the shops, stores, and streets. As a result of the inertia of the population, the general ignorance of the technique of raising rabbits, the imported animals died. Only thanks to this, the Russians, who feel for the rabbit the same repugnance that we have for rats, saved themselves from having to eat what they started to call, quote, Stalinist beef. Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler. Here is a comparison that naturally rises to one's mind. Of the three despots, the most absolute is, without doubt, Stalin. And granted, it's important to note that at this point, just like with Trotsky, the Holocaust and Barbarossa had not transpired yet. So we have to keep that in mind when people are making these comparisons. Those comparisons might not seem as apt today, but prior to the Holocaust and Barbarossa, they definitely were more apt. Where at least the destructiveness of Nazism was not completely apparent to everyone. All right, new section. Section 3, the new classes. It takes some time for a revolution to bring forth the social form that it bears, and it is hard for its contemporaries to discern what is the product of its convulsions. A regime as absolute as Stalin's is not a new fact. We have had a number of similar dictatorships. The unusual thing is that this dictatorship is slowly but profoundly installing something new in social economy and human mentality. On the one hand, competition gives way to a plan in the USSR. On the other hand, the capitalists, the big bourgeois, has disappeared, and the small bourgeoisie is disappearing. Who has taken their place? The Communist Party has not troubled itself about suppressing the privileges it has taken away from the old ruling classes. The Communist Party not only has reserved these privileges, but has surrounded them with a halo, the halo of the revolution. Let us examine the social composition of the contemporary Russian society. We can distinguish in Russia the following classes. A. The quote, manual laborer, industrial and agricultural. B. The small and middle quote, employee, clerk. C. The specialist, the responsible, and the high functionary. New heading. The so-called quote, manual laborer. Socialism is supposed to place the means of production in the hands of the workers. Socialism is supposed to give the workers the initiative and control of production and distribution. What we have seen of the material conditions and the level of liberty of the Russian workers shows us that not only has this aim not been attained, but there is nothing permitting us to believe that the country is moving in that direction. The Soviet factory is still the galley where the worker slaves at his labor. It is a place of suffering that is made hateful by obsessing propaganda, by the belt system, by piecework. The worker has nothing to say about the running of the factories and the disposal of his labor. He has nothing to say about the regulation of his work. He is sweated for a miserable wage and a starvation pension. The field laborer is also a wage worker, or is fast becoming a wage worker. The field laborer has no land of his own. Quote, land to the peasants has been changed to, quote, land to the state. The agricultural laborer does piecework like his brother in the factory. The relations that the factory worker finds most hateful in his place of work exist also in the fields. There are, quote, norms to fulfill at any cost, fines for work that is badly performed, or for lateness, for lack of respect to superiors, etc. The Soviet workers in the fields and in the cities are new serfs. They lead a miserable existence. Their food is doled out to them. They are not free to act, to speak, to go where they want to go. They are constantly forced to learn, to digest, to think an official religion, a single catechism from which their minds may in no way be diverted. Labor is in the USSR, as elsewhere, the only source of all value. But as everywhere else, the workers do not receive anything near the product of their labor. They are victims of a, quote, distribution of the total social wealth that is more scandalously unequal than that existing in any avowed capitalist country. They are robbed of the product of their labor and have not the possibility of seeking to go where they might get a little more for their labor power because they are attached to the agricultural enterprise and to the factory. The small and middle employee. New heading, the small and middle employee. The Soviet, quote, employees, taken as a whole, constitute an intermediate class in Russia. In the Soviet regime, the employees are both pariahs and privileged as compared to the workers. They serve as a buffer between the state, the lower bureaucratic functions of which they execute, and the workers whom they direct. These are the, quote, bureaucrats who transmit the orders from above. Ensconced in their office cages, they distribute food cards, giving the citizens the right to a meager ration. They transmit and establish the norms required by the top. They are the innumerable little bosses who watch that the producer does not transgress against the top. They are detested by the workers and the agricultural laborers. To the latter, they appear to represent the part of society that does not produce, for they are many and are the tangible and most and ever-present personification of the parasitism of the regime. It is they who are often envied by the workers, for it is them whom the workers see every day, while the big fellows, the real bosses, are much more, quote, invisible than the real bosses in the avowed capitalist countries. And the veritable masters do not fail to exploit the optic error of the workers in order to turn the hate of the masses from themselves to the helpless, quote, employees. When they speak up on high about the mistakes, bad ways, and lack of interest of the bureaucracy, it is these little, quote, employees who are meant. Since in no country are so many offices and sub-officials needed as in the, quote, planned and economically organized USSR, the numerical growth of the class of small, quote, employees is astounding. For 21 million workers, not counting the peasants, there are at least 8 million employees. Stooping over his papers, the quote employee establishes contact with the center by accomplishing the bureaucratic task necessary for the transmission of orders over the different branches of the of the state framework. Or he supervises the execution of the order by the lowest category in the social scale, the producer. The quote employee transcribes into figures and formula everything accomplished around him in his locality and region, but the employee also draws up statistics on what is done against the will of the center. The employee's figures and reports serve as a basis for the orders of tomorrow, helping to formulate the organization or the repression that the brains of the plan decide on. The quote employee is the middle class of the new regime. The little quote employee is a pariah. The quote employee is hated by the worker, yet the employee's standard of living is often below that of the workers, and it is very hard for him to rise to something better. The middle quote employee, however, is quite a privileged individual, for as a group he touches at one extreme the arbitrary standard of living of the higher ups. Furthermore, he is not only to quote obey, sometimes he commands a more or less important group of workers. He does not have to do piecework or sweat at the belt. He senses himself to be more or less bound to the existing state power, of which he is really a small cog. New heading, the responsible specialist. We use this term to designate all those who profit by their high function in society, where the enjoyment of social and economic privileges is determined by what the Russians call, quote, functions. There are many specialists in Russia. Some have always existed. Others are the special creation of the Soviet regime. The specialists we know, engineers, architects, jurists, doctors, professors, army officers, exist there as elsewhere. A new type of specialist has been created by the new regime, where he is indispensable: the agitator, the organizer of the masses, the artist, the state writer, the propagandist of the last order from above, in a word, the quote engineers of the soul, end quote, extolled by Stalin himself. The economists of the plan also constitute a new type of specialist. The responsible specialist is a specialist who, besides possessing professional knowledge and a diplomat, has the responsibility for running an important wheel of the social machine. The directors of factories, the heads of large establishments, high officials, commanding officers, managers of large newspapers, the big shots of the trade unions and Soviets, they are responsible specialists. They are responsible specialists. Today, the specialist is recruited from among the young. It is the young specialist of worker origin who is most representative of his kind in 1937. He was born with the new regime. His kingdom on earth arrived with the new regime. He who attains one of the mentioned responsible posts must perforce be the quote, before the quote, directed economy, and help with all his might its consolidation and progress. What does it matter to him if every turn of the special wheel of the, quote, social mechanism whose handle manipulates, crushes the serfs under it? The same turn of the wheel that crushes the industrial serfs below opens for him a wide field of activity and the perspective of an unequaled future. Let's look at. He cannot be aware of the fact. He cannot even be aware of the fact that the serfs below are being crushed. Neither can the great majority of the bourgeois of the avowed capitalist countries understand the constant crushing of the workers by the system that feeds their ambitions and yields them profit. The young specialist, confident of the future, lives most of the time in his calculations and formulae. He does not worry about the workers. For him, they are merely the instruments of his, quote, grandiose achievements. Or he sincerely believes that he is working As the state catechism says, for their emancipation, sometimes the specialist happens to complain about the regime, but not because the workers possess no power, but because he himself does not possess enough power. It is quite true that he does not enjoy any political liberty. For this reason, he sometimes shows opposition to the Stalinist dictatorship, of which he is, however, a legitimate product. The sight of the extreme exploitation of the workers fails to fill him with any remorse, for he had never promised anything to the proletariat. Quote, the USSR is the paradise of the savant, end quote. This formula, drawn from the account of a Soviet tour by General Perrier, a professor at the Polytechnic Institute, has been picked up and echoed in chorus by the entire communist press outside of Russia. It is a very happy phrase, although somewhat ambitious. The process of formation of the new class has not yet been completed. The new class feels that the future belongs to it, even more than the present. It is now marching towards its, quote, paradise. Industrialization creates an incessantly renewed and never satisfied demand for, quote, specialists and, quote, responsibles. Industrialization increases specialists and, quote, responsibles' importance. In the Soviet economic organization, constantly growing more modern and complicated, the specialists are becoming more irreplaceable as the specialists acquire experience in their functions. The specialist is a precious instrument that the political bureau is obliged to handle carefully. The political bureau cannot afford to break this instrument without risking the destruction of the entire economy. An individual who has proved his value as an organizer and can apply his elbows has a place waiting for him among the specialists. There are accompanying risks, but considering the prize, they are worth taking. Here it is not one's fortune that is put at stake, but one's function. The candidates are socially young. They have the boldness and unconcern of the early bourgeois. Like the early bourgeois, they are ready to leap to take chances in order to arrive at positions exalted enough to turn the head of the most experienced. It is an error to believe that all the specialists and the big responsibles are narrow, lopsided bureaucrats. No, they are young men who have the, quote, stuff and a lot of energy. They attain, at times, in the exercise of their functions, an understanding of business, a mastery of decision, and breadth of view that can be envied by the American businessman. Their power, their life, and their risks are of an entirely new form. No privileged class can know them before. Has known them before. Altogether, this power, this life, these risks constitute a new world, the, quote, paradise of the specialist. Traditional capitalism cannot offer any certainty to its beneficiaries. The biggest industrialists can always expect to have known and unknown rivals rise against them and defeat them. They can only act empirically. The responsible specialist, a part of the plan, can act with much more assuredness than any capitalist. For the responsible specialist commands everything in his region. The responsible specialist holds centralized in his office all the threads of activity around him. With chalk and an eraser, by modifying the curves and figures in the graph chart back of his desk, he can change the rhythm of life of all the human beings in his domain. The well-being of the workers is for him also a little curve, no more than a little curve. Outside of the intellectual interest and moral satisfaction that his work offers him, the specialist has the advantage of enjoying a relative high standard of living as compared to the misery of the others. He frequents the theater, intellectual and literary circles, concerts. Everything that he enjoys is part of his function. He has at his disposal an auto, stenographers, various personal help. The next step would be giving him political power. That will come. To start with, the specialist had various social origins. However, preference was given to members of the working class, in the name of which the new world was being constructed. This was of slight consolation to the workers, because bosses of plebeian origin have never been any better than masters with other derivations. What is happening at present is something that has always happened with new privileged castes. It is becoming more and more true that the specialist's son becomes himself a specialist. The specialist's son has the advantage of a high standard of living. This makes the specialist more apt for study. And the specialist's son, this makes the specialist's son more apt for study. And the specialist's son has already received from his milieu an education that prepares him for his future life. With the aid of his relatives, he can prepare himself better for the examinations that candidates hailing from other strata. It is quite natural for him to move in the direction indicated for him by everything that he has heard and learned since childhood. Furthermore, his family has numerous connections, and in that country, pull is essential. Most often, the specialists belong to the Communist Party. Thus, politics and technique do not wander apart. The higher the sphere, the more party members are bound in it. The responsible specialist is nearly always a member of the party. As a result of this condition, the Soviet system assumes a homogeneity and a solidity never known in any other regime. The communist specialist, in the official sense of the word, is the type of boss par excellence. He is the synthesis of economic and political power. The class struggle continues. New section. New heading. This class struggle continues. It is quite obvious that we are not dealing here with a socialist regime in its birth pangs. Neither is the Soviet order peculiarly Russian. I think we have here a new kind of social order with new classes. We cannot accept the subterfuge according to which there are no classes in the USSR, but only a, quote, Stalinist bureaucracy. It is not enough that the caste of, quote, specialists and, quote, responsibles do not appear to come under the definition of a ruling class that is laid down by Marxism. Footnote. That is, what is retailed as Marxism by Soviet professors and their Western brothers, who find it most suitable to their employers' interest to turn to the middle of the 19th century for an absolute model of capitalism. It's from the editor. End footnote. Where am I? There are classes in the USSR, a privileged class and an exploited class, a ruling class and a ruled class. Between the two, there is a wide difference in the standard of living. The, quote, classes in the railway trains correspond exactly to the existing social classes. The same is true about Soviet boats, restaurants, theaters, and stores. For the comfort of some people, palaces rise on pleasant sites. For others, wooden barracks are boarded together in the vicinity of warehouses and smelly factories. The same people and their children always occupy the palaces. The same people continue to live in the barracks. There is no private ownership in the USSR. There is only state ownership. But the state no more represents the interest of all the citizens than the previous regimes. A small number enjoy this state property. The great number of people support it, produce it, respect it, and are separated from it by a huge police apparatus of repression, which is by far larger than the one that formerly separated the people from private property. As always, education, knowledge, worthwhile experience form the heirloom left by the privileged set to their offspring. Energy and ambition are the appanage of the masters, of the well-groomed, healthy people who enjoy homes full of light and gaiety and are free from material care. The struggle of the new slave, the mind of the new slave, on the other hand, is absorbed by the daily struggle for a living. His character is molded by the obedience that he must show at every moment of his life. The, quote, social function, end quote, which is the justification of the new privileged class, is a worthy heir to the privilege of blood. descent claimed by the nobles of the past and to the, quote, money privilege held by the bourgeois. We have here a modern form of privilege that corresponds to the present degree of development of technique, science, and consciousness. The old privileges no longer correspond to the services rendered. Society is preparing a renewal rather than a suppression of privilege. It is true that capitalist concentration brings a new class to possess itself of the means of production, but there is nothing to assure us that this new class will necessarily be the class of producers. Barring the way to the proletariat, the class of high functionaries rises on the road to power. The workers do not necessarily have a world to gain and their chains to lose. There are heavier chains they can forge for themselves. The end of capitalism can quite easily give birth to an economy that is directed by a new class living on profit. It does not necessarily have to lead to the free association, of workers. Woe to the workers if, bred in the new religion of technique and science, and the idolatry of the possessors of technique and science, they hand themselves over to the new masters, yielding to an enthusiasm over giant constructions, as if their ideal were to be exploited more scientifically. I really like that. One second. Come on. 1 second. Back to the text. History is full of the unforeseen. Nothing assures us that the Russian Revolution will end in the society whose premises we have just described. Great changes are possible. The Russian Revolution has shown us the possibility of such a society. It has produced the embryo of a society that we must oppose. In 1917, the Russian people made their revolution. The historian has now to write how the Russian Revolution has been stolen from the Russian people. But the struggle continues. The formation of the new classes gives rise to new class combats. No more than anywhere else in the world do we find in Russia a community of interest between those on the top and those on the bottom. There is a fundamental contradiction between the state apparatus, desiring to have its plans executed at an increasingly faster rate, wanting to give less to the workers, and the wage workers who want the opposite. It is natural for this contradiction to grow sharper with the evolution of the regime. It is not surprising that thousands of revolutionists, anarchists, socialists, communists, trade unionists, and simple workers who have refused to give up their right to think for themselves, go to prison for daring to say aloud what so many say to themselves. Voices are being raised in spite of the cruel repression. These voices, still expressing their faith in the possibility of a better world, provide us with the assurance that those down below do not yield. Thousands of workers who have been reduced to bread and water burst now and then in spontaneous movements of revolt. Strikes have not disappeared. Individual terror is much more common in Russia than is known abroad. These attempts become known only when they hit such highly placed personages as Kirov. I think it's pretty certain now that Kirov wasn't just some spontaneous assassination. The unequaled precautions that are taken by the directors of the Soviet exploiting machine to safeguard their lives go to prove that these worthies are in constant fear of a population that appears to be thoroughly exhausted and terrorized. The class struggle continues. Thank you so much for listening.